The winding dirt road cut through the open field, disappearing into the thick trees. Claire and Dave watched from the car window as they approached their new home, an old farmhouse that seemed to stand alone, isolated from the world. For them, moving to the countryside was an opportunity to start fresh, far from the chaos of the city and the problems that had been haunting them. Claire, especially, longed for silence and peace. When the car stopped in front of the house, Claire smiled. The structure was charming, with a rustic wooden facade weathered by time, surrounded by vast fields and dense forests in the distance. The place represented everything they needed: tranquility, a fresh start, and an environment to reconnect. Dave stepped out of the car, looking around and breathing in the crisp air. "Perfect," he said, and Claire nodded, smiling softly. The first days were idyllic. They spent their time exploring the area, getting to know every corner of the house, which still carried an air of mystery, as if it hid the secrets of generations past. Though the house was a bit worn, it seemed like the perfect retreat they had been searching for. Claire especially loved the bedroom with a view of the forest. At night, the moon cast a soft glow over the trees, creating a sense of calm. She slept deeply, wrapped in the peacefulness of rural life. But after a few days, Claire began to notice something strange. Each morning, when she looked out the window, the view seemed different. The angle of the light, the position of the trees, it was subtle but unsettling. She wasn't sure if it was just her imagination or a sign of adjusting to their new environment. "Have you noticed the house seems to be in a different spot when we wake up?" Claire asked Dave one night during dinner. Dave chuckled, finding the idea absurd. "You must be tired," he replied, dismissing her concerns. "We're far from the city. The sounds and views are different here. You just need time to get used to it." Claire tried to ignore the feeling, but the next morning, it intensified. When she opened the window, the forest seemed much closer than it had the day before. She quickly ran outside to check, and the ground around the house showed strange marks, as if the earth had been subtly disturbed. Could the house be moving? Claire shook her head, pushing the ridiculous thought away. But over the next few days, the feeling persisted. The house seemed to be in a different spot every time they woke up. The shadows of the trees fell at odd angles, and the dirt road that led to the house seemed farther away on some mornings. Something was wrong, Claire was sure of it. But Dave remained skeptical, attributing her concerns to an overactive imagination and the stress of adapting to their new surroundings. Yet every time Claire looked out the window, the discomfort grew, and soon, what seemed like a simple illusion would transform into something far more terrifying. That night, the house was wrapped in an unsettling silence. Claire couldn't sleep, her body tense, her mind revisiting the strange sensations of the past few days. She lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. Dave slept soundly beside her, unaware of the growing unease that consumed her. Maybe he's right, Claire thought. Maybe I'm imagining things. Even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her, and she fell into a light, restless sleep. The next morning, she awoke with a start. Something was different, very different. Claire rushed to the window, and as she pulled back the curtains, her stomach sank. The house wasn't in the same place. The surrounding landscape had shifted dramatically overnight. The dirt road that was once visible from the window was now completely out of sight, replaced by a dense forest that seemed closer than ever. With her heart pounding, Claire hurried downstairs and stepped outside. The ground was damp, and there were deep, strange tracks in the earth, as though something heavy had dragged the house to a new location. The trees were much closer now, and the sunlight barely penetrated the dense canopy. "Dave?" Claire called, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. Dave emerged from the bedroom, frowning as he saw the expression on her face. "What is it now?" "The house, it moved," she said, looking around as if expecting him to see the same thing. "Look, everything is different out here." Dave, still skeptical, walked to the door and looked out at the surroundings. "It doesn't look different," he said slowly, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But wasn't the road visible from here?" Claire nodded, her eyes fixed on the forest. "Something is happening to this house, Dave. This isn't normal." He shrugged, trying to remain calm. Maybe it's a landslide or some other natural phenomenon, he suggested, though the explanation didn't seem to convince him either. We'll investigate the land later. Despite his attempt to reassure her, Claire knew that whatever was happening went far beyond anything logical. The unease that lingered over Claire refused to leave her. Even though Dave tried to maintain an air of normalcy, Claire knew something was terribly wrong. After the house's inexplicable movement, she insisted that they explore the surrounding land. Maybe by examining it more closely, they could find some explanation. Reluctantly, Dave agreed. They decided to venture out after breakfast to investigate the area. As they walked around the house, Claire began to notice details she hadn't seen before. The land, once so familiar, now seemed hostile. The trees that had once formed a natural, welcoming barrier now appeared taller, darker, their twisted branches casting ominous shadows. The wind blew with unexpected force, as if trying to push them away. After circling the property a third time, Claire noticed something unusual in the earth. There was a series of deep marks, as though the ground had been disturbed by something very heavy, something that had, in fact, moved. She called Dave over, pointing out what appeared to be a long trail of upturned soil that led toward the back of the property, near an old, overgrown hill. Dave knelt down to examine the marks. "This isn't normal," he finally admitted, voicing what Claire had feared. The marks in the ground were long and continuous, as if something had been dragged for several meters. What disturbed him most was that the tracks seemed to encircle the house, as though it had been moving from one spot to another, guided by some invisible force. "What if the house is really moving?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "But how is that even possible?" Without an answer, Dave decided they needed to investigate further. Following the trail, the couple walked until they reached what appeared to be a hidden clearing. In the center, they found a series of strange objects, old stones arranged in a circle, covered with moss, and etched with symbols that Claire didn't recognize. "This wasn't here before," Dave said, bewildered. "These stones, they look ancient." Claire moved closer, her heart pounding. As she ran her hand over the stones, a chill ran down her spine. There was something deeply wrong with this place. The air here felt heavier, charged with an invisible, oppressive energy. Looking more closely, she noticed that the marks in the ground continued up to the base of the stones. It was as if the house was following a path, moving toward this mysterious circle. "What does this mean?" Dave asked, breaking the tense silence. Clara didn't know, but it was clear now that the house wasn't just walking on its own. Something was guiding it. Claire's discomfort grew with every new discovery. The marks in the ground, the strange circle of stones, and the oppressive feeling that seemed to envelop the house weighed on her like an invisible presence. When they returned to the house after their exploration, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Dave tried to stay calm, but fear had begun to creep into his eyes as well. While Dave searched online for any clues about what they might be dealing with, Claire decided to explore the house itself. They had barely touched the basement since they moved in, a part of the house that had been locked and forgotten. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and fear, Claire searched for the keys they found in the kitchen, believing one would unlock the old rusted padlock that sealed the basement. Descending the creaky stairs into the basement, a wave of cold washed over her. The air was dense and damp, with a musty smell of decay lingering in the room. On the walls were old shelves covered in dust and forgotten furniture draped in yellowed sheets. But something quickly caught her eye. An old chest, covered in cobwebs, pushed into the darkest corner. Claire knelt down and opened the chest, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, she found stacks of aged papers, covered in faded handwriting. They were journals, left behind by the house's previous residents. With trembling hands, Claire picked one up and began to read. What she found left her horrified. The entries spoke of an ancient entity, a malevolent force that had inhabited the land long before the house was built. According to the journal, this entity controlled the house's movements, driving its occupants to madness and eventually death. The previous residents had tried to flee, but the house followed them, moving in the night, always trapping them. The journal mentioned ancient ruins on the property, the same stone circle that Claire and Dave had discovered where the presence of the entity was strongest. The house seemed to be drawn toward that place, following a pattern of sacrifice. As Claire flipped through the pages, her terror deepened. The accounts detailed the gradual descent into insanity faced by those who lived in the house before them. Shadows had begun to appear in the corners of the rooms, whispers in the wind that they could never fully make out, and an overwhelming sense that they were being watched by something ancient and powerful. The previous residents had tried to stop it, but one by one they had succumbed to the entity's influence. "Dave!" Claire's voice cracked as she called out, her fear echoing in the cold basement. Dave rushed down the stairs, concern etched on his face as he saw the panic in Claire's eyes. She handed him the journal, her hands trembling. "The house, it's controlled by something old and evil. We need to leave now." Dave quickly scanned the pages, his face losing color with each word. The horror etched in the words of the former occupants was undeniable. "This can't be real," he murmured, but the evidence in front of him was too clear to ignore. At that moment, they both realized that the house wasn't just walking, it was being drawn towards something terrifying, something inevitable. And they were next in line, trapped in the same cycle that had claimed the lives of those before them. The terror enveloped Claire and Dave like a suffocating fog. After reading the journals, there was no longer any room for denial. The house was moving, guided by an unseen force that they couldn't comprehend, and now they were caught in its deadly game. Dave dropped the journal on the floor, his face pale as he struggled to think clearly. "We need to get out of here now," he said, his voice filled with urgency. But when they tried to leave through the front door, they found themselves trapped. The door wouldn't budge, as though it had been sealed shut by an invisible hand, despite the lock remaining open. Panic surged through Claire as she ran to the windows, only to find them similarly sealed. It was as if the house itself had closed around them, determined to keep them inside. "It's not letting us leave," Claire whispered, her voice shaking. "The house, or whatever it is, wants us here." Dave began banging on the walls, desperately searching for a weak spot, but the walls felt unyielding, solid. With every passing minute, the sense of being watched intensified. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and crawl, as if something was lurking within the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then the house began to tremble. The floorboards creaked, the windows rattled, and the furniture shook as the entire structure groaned and shifted. Claire's eyes widened in terror. She knew what this meant. The house was moving again. But this time, the movement was more violent, more erratic, as if the entity that controlled it was growing impatient, driving them toward a final destination. "We have to get out of the basement," Clara said, panic in her voice. "If the house keeps moving like this, it's going to take us somewhere dangerous." Dave nodded, and together they bolted back upstairs. But what they found outside the basement was even more terrifying. The house had moved perilously close to the edge of a cliff. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and Claire could see the jagged rocks far below, just meters from where the house now stood. The edge of the cliff was looming closer with every shudder. "It's going to throw us over," Dave said in a hushed voice, horror filling his eyes. "This thing, it's trying to kill us." Claire's mind raced as the ground continued to shake. Then she remembered something from the journal. One of the previous residents had written about attempting to appease the entity with a ritual at the stone circle. They mentioned that trying to destroy the house had only made things worse, but the journal hinted that while the entity couldn't be defeated, its control could be broken temporarily through sacrifice. "There's a chance," Claire said, her voice trembling with urgency. "The stone circle, maybe we can stop this." The journal mentioned something about a sacrifice. "If we can reach the stones, maybe we can break the entity's hold, or at least stop the house from moving." But before she could finish, the house lurched violently again, tilting to one side as if preparing to tumble off the cliff. "We have to try," Dave shouted. "We don't have any other choice." They rushed to the back door, pushing it with all their strength. Miraculously, it gave way, and and they burst out into the open, sprinting across the field toward the stone circle. Behind them, the house continued to creak and shift, dragging itself toward the edge of the cliff, intent on taking them with it. The wind howled around them as they ran, the sky darkening with ominous clouds. Claire and Dave knew they were running out of time. The house was relentless, and they were in a race not just against the clock, but against a malevolent force that sought their destruction. Claire and Dave reached the stone circle, breathless and terrified, but they knew this was their only chance. Months later, the house was on the market again. It seemed serene, hushed, a relic in the vast expanse of the surrounding fields. The whispers of Claire and Dave's tragic tale had softened with time, and few recalled the events that unfolded in that solitary spot. Real estate agents introduced the house to new prospective owners, extolling its rustic allure, its aged exterior, and the generous grounds. A new family explored the property, captivated by the scenery and the tranquility that seemed to seep from the countryside. "It's perfect," the wife said, smiling at her husband. "Just what we've been searching for." The real estate agent, with a warm smile, guided them to the front door. "It's a very special house," he said. "It has a rich history, but you'll adore it." And in silence, the house observed them, awaiting, for the cycle is eternal.